But first, chat, a word from our sponsor, Falcoshin. So I will explain this. This was a proposed entry or article for the Cabal Prevailer, our server's very own news outlet. And speaking of which, where is the Prevailer herself? There she is in Pit 1. Are they doing the Pitterstein thing? Yeah, they are. hello, Duchess. So this was submitted. I think that I did ask Duchess permission to do this. This was submitted to Duchess for her Cabal-based publication, The Prevailer, and this is from a very lefty and very unpopular member of our server called Falcoshin. And we're gonna I figured like let's read through it, because the thing with Falcoshin is that he has absolutely no decency in terms of debating, so it's impossible to talk to him. If you imagine like the whole like pigeon on a chessboard analogy, if you wanted to try and play chess with someone who was just unwilling to care about the rules, then the chess itself basically doesn't exist. It's just a bunch of pieces on the board, and that's what happens with the debate as well. It's just a bunch of noises because they're not willing to engage with the debate. This is from them, but because it's pre-written, they have no opportunity to totally dislodge the process of reason. So we can read over it and see what we think, and see what their opinion is, and then discuss. As if it says, I hope you can all behave enough to not to tell them Uzalu covered this unless the wizard wants us to. Well, I'm not going to say I want you to, but I don't really care. Doesn't matter. The whole argument of don't feed the troll, yeah, but if we're eating better than the troll is and we're feeding him table scraps to continue providing us with content, that's fine. The feed the troll thing is a warning against letting yourself just be used by a troll. That's not what's happening here. We are using him for content. So this is a post that was sent to me by Duchess in Discord, but I've cropped out the name of the person that sent it. This is, as far as Duchess tells me, directly the text of the article that Falcoshin submitted to the Prevailer. As far as I know, also, the Prevailer is not... this is way too much for one article, for one publication, so it's not going to end up in there, but we will see. Anyway, so... A very common refrain, he says, amongst the right wing is the preservation of comedy from a woke left that seeks to cancel everything right of Stalin. A small exaggeration, but not that small. While it's, as far as I'm aware, he says, difficult to truly assess the health of comedy as an art form. Sure, somewhat difficult, but not that difficult. It's clear that the right wing, he says, is complaining about the waning prevalence of 2000s and early 2010s style edgy roast comedy. And this is where the disagreements begin. No, Falco, it's a little bit more than that. For one thing, comedy which is offensive has existed for all of human history, essentially, as far as back as comedy itself has existed. But the reason that we are defending it is because it's the first thing that any totalitarian attacks, and at the very least, one of the main things. Because the requirement that a healthy society have free expression sufficient enough to be offensive, especially where that's also funny, is so important that what requirement could you bring up that could be more important than that? It has nothing to do with a particular era or nostalgia. It has to do with principles basic to the running of a healthy society. It goes on to say, now I'm not here to deny this is the case because it most likely is. What I'm here to do is explain why this is the case, primarily by examining the joke, as it were, why the right doesn't understand this joke, and what this means for the right's understanding of not just comedy, but the world around them. So his premise is already pretty flawed, but we can continue anyway. If he's going to make an argument that it's not a single joke, it's not even really about the comedy, it's about the free expression anyway, would I choose to watch that comedy if I had the choice? Probably not. I don't really watch like stand-up comedians anymore. I used to years ago. It's not about the comedy. It's about the freedom to say it, and about what the horrific implications are for a society where you are not allowed to say it. The cornerstone of comedy is absurdity, he says, and not only is edgy humor no exception, but it relies on this perhaps more than any other forms of comedy. I would not say the cornerstone of comedy is absurdity. It can be, and in some sense it's sort of in every joke, but only, I wouldn't use that word for it. The cornerstone of comedy is a twist, such that you set up an expectation in the audience of the joke, and then you deliver to them something different, which is connected to the setup in a way they didn't expect. Every joke will fill this basic structure, and everything that's funny will ultimately be fittable into this basic structure. You could argue that is absurd in some sense, but it's not the right word for it. It's unexpected. And the reason I believe that evolution filters for this, that it's good, that for one thing, it wins mates, particularly from males to females, is that it takes genuine intelligence, not only to know what they're going to expect from what you say, but also to be able to lead them onto that and then to go to something else which is still connected but isn't what anyone expected. And that is why comedy is so useful, because it takes linguistic ability, it takes social ability, it takes cultural awareness, it takes some psychological awareness. These are all good things to filter for, and it's so simple, it's so condensed. Evolution finds these ways of selecting positively very strongly in these very condensed examples that actually link back to a lot of useful qualities in humans, which filter for a more healthy society when they're applied. That's why comedy exists, that's why comedy is useful. So I can kind of see what he means here, but I would not word it that way, and I expect it's more than just the wording that's at fault. Let's find out. He says, while one could argue there is absurdity in even broaching subjects like rape and racism in comedy just as a matter of course, the absurdity also lies in the shared no proofreading here for your for your publication. Unfortunately, he didn't have the respect to proofread his own work. Also lies in the shared cultural reference, a cultural understanding that these things are bad and that making light of them is terrible. Making light of rape and racism, or just let's just say like bad topics in general, depends what you mean by making light of them. If you're saying like genuinely not taking them seriously when you're not actually trying to make a joke, if you are honestly saying like rape is not a serious issue, that's you would lose respect for someone if they honestly believed that. But it would be very hard to tell if they weren't joking, to be honest. However, there is no topic that should be beyond joking. And it's not just because it's absurd to imply that it's not serious. But no comedy that involves rape or racism is at any point genuinely putting across the case that they are not serious issues. Except those where they honestly believe that. I mean, in the case of, like, very few people believe rape is not a serious issue. But racism is a different question because these days it's a bit more controversial. There are some people that seriously believe it's not a serious issue, and I disagree with them, but there's something to their arguments anyway. But yeah, in the general case, no one's actually making the case that they are not serious. We'll continue. He then says, this creates a sort of self-deprecating joke where a comedian is pretending to be unaware of how terrible the thing they are saying are, and any laughter derived from the joke is at their expense rather than whatever group they are denigrating. So that's always been the refrain for at least 10 years of the culture war for why jokes about offensive things are funny or are useful. And yes, that is mostly true, but I feel like there is more to it than that as well. It's not just about what you can literally do with the topic. It's about how that topic fits into society as well. If it's a topic, so is not really controversial. Very few people in society think it's not a serious issue. Very few. Racism is more controversial, but the point is it's not really about people that think they're not serious. It's about people that think that you can still find humor in them, primarily because there are others in society that take them way too seriously or treat them in a way which is way oversensitive in ways that don't make sense. So should we care about rape? Yes. But should we destroy the lives of any man merely accused of it by a woman because we should always believe a woman? No. And that insane oversensitivity to the issue opens up the realm for political commentary via talking about the topic. And one of the best ways to talk about a topic without making it all doom and gloom is to make it funny. It just enhances the quality of the topic in general. So it is not just about the joke is that you're the bad guy. No, it's also about the political angle of some people take this, treat this in the wrong way. Let's make fun of them through the topic, which can be a minefield. but people managed to pull it off. They've been managing to pull it off for a long time. You could call it satire. In fact, there's a word for it. You could use that word for it. Sure, I mean, I just made the word up on the spot, but yeah, you could just use that word for it. We'll continue. So it's not just that, it's also the other thing. He says, they're expensive. However, as I said, he says, this depends on a shared cultural understanding that these things are bad. So what happens when that shared cultural understanding is called into question? Sure, Muslims. Exactly. Muslims aren't going to get the joke. If you go out on stage and you make a joke which relies on everyone in the audience understanding that rape is bad, Muslims in the audience are going to have no idea what you're talking about. It's like, yeah, I mean, if Aisha, the 9-year-old, if you are married to them, then yeah, it isn't a serious matter, because most, I believe, Muslims in the Middle East, perhaps there are some exceptional countries there which wouldn't, but most Muslims in the Middle East would believe that if you're married, then there is no such thing as rape, and in fact that the man is entitled to beat the woman if she does not offer him sexual services. Although to divorce if there's no tea, that's different. But yeah, so yes, it does depend on that. So yes, Falcon, I'm sure here is talking about Muslims in the audience. Obviously, particularly only the really sort of conservative Muslims, not the more westernized ones, but they're almost worse in other ways. Enter, he says, Donald Trump. Oh no. When he first announced his presidency in 2015, he was treated as a joke candidate due in large part to a past of bizarrely racist conspiracism. Now, that's not true at all, Falco. That's not why he was treated as a joke candidate. He was treated as a joke candidate because he was a bombastic TV celebrity who no one believed could actually take on the Washington establishment. Because at that point, it was so strongly assumed by that establishment that they had a lock on politics, given all the money men were on their side. Both parties were essentially playing the same game. A lot of the election infrastructure by then, I'm sure, was rigged. All that stuff they had on their side. All the press was totally on their side, all that stuff. So they assumed it was impossible for anyone to break that status quo. Then Trump comes along, and what happened then? Were they totally against him? Did they try and destroy? No, they supported him. The establishment supported Donald Trump initially because they thought he was such a dumb joke candidate that they wanted to run Hillary against him because they knew Hillary would win easily because he was a joke candidate. So they tried to sabotage the Republican Party by getting Trump more popular in that party, and it worked. It wasn't just because of their help, by the way. Trump was also, as you all know, very competent, surprisingly competent, and also charismatic. Again, another thing which evolution, condenses a lot of important things into this small thing, charisma, which is actually very important. And he ended up becoming the Republican candidate. And then they switched tactics, or sometime before that, arguably. They switched tactics because at that point it wasn't about supporting Trump so that he would beat the other Republicans. At that point, they got what they wanted. Trump had defeated all of the serious opponents, and now it was just about ushering Hillary in, rolling out the red carpet for her, and Trump could go off and he enjoy his billions. He probably wasn't a serious candidate anyway, was he? And then he won. That was funny. That was a good joke. The whole thing is hilarious. And frankly, that exact election cycle had the setup of a joke. We all thought we knew where it was going to go. Most people in the world who were observing thought it was a foregone conclusion that Hillary was going to win. Even I thought it was more likely that Hillary would win than Trump. At the end, on the last day, on the voting day, you had, was it New York Times, probability prediction for the candidate, go from Hillary up at 100%, Trump down at 1%. This glorious X shape that formed throughout the night. It's my favorite visual data in history because it just shows how out of touch they were. That was funny. And then we got 4 years but the Western world got 4 years of a very competent president who they could only get rid of by rigging him out. It may have been CNN field. It was one of them anyway. So yeah, that was Trump. But yeah, the Obama birth certificate thing, it wasn't because of race, it was because of eligibility, but the fact that he was not white was sort of like a hint that, well, probably he might not be American then. It wasn't because he was black. But the idea that he could have been born in Kenya was plausible. If he was completely white, it would be less plausible. So the race that he was half black, in fact, but the race that he is was a sort of a hint at it, but it wasn't the reason. It wasn't because he was black they were trying to keep him out. But of course, that's what Falco would prefer to believe, because it's much easier to dismiss his opponents that way. And yes, it would be a conspiracy theory that it would be obscured, the birth certificate thing. Now, I'm still not sure if the birth certificate thing was ever sort of true. But Falco here doesn't know. I doubt he's ever looked into it. I doubt he's ever looked into it to demonstrate. No. He definitely was born in the US. Or if he has, I suspect he's just found a source and believed it, rather than confirming that it's true. I did see a few bits of compelling information over the years that indicate that, yeah, maybe there was something to this, but I don't think it ever amounted to anything. But perhaps you guys know more than I do. I did hear the idea at some point that the birther conspiracy thing was started as a way to contain the conspiracy theorists of the opposing side, to throw them at some implausible conspiracy theory, while they ignored more plausible ones, such as Michelle Obama is a man, which I'm not sure I believe it, but there is some hot reasons to believe it. So yeah, there's that. But yeah, that was like, obviously the Trump bought a little bit into the birther conspiracy thing, but not much. And I think the reason was because Obama was not a very good president. But let's continue. The Obama birth certificate controversy of 4 years prior, for instance, they say, Falco says, that was only growing the more he campaigned. I don't think that the Obama thing became more popular as Trump was campaigning. He basically dropped it before that. Yeah, Dacus says, I heard the birther thing originated from the Clinton campaign. I think I heard that too. Like op research, like the same thing as the Trump Pissgate thing, where it just wasn't true, but the Clinton campaign pushed it because it was useful. That may have been what they were doing internally in the DNC for Obama. I had heard that too, yes. This was sort of before I was looking into politics properly, so I don't know the exact details. For those who don't know, by the way, this was written by Falcoshin, a sort of unpopular detractor in Cabal, and it's just his opinion. We'll see what he's saying here. However, something unexpected happened. He grew popular enough for him becoming president to be a real possibility, and with it, American society had to face the reality that this shared understanding of sexism and racism being bad was not as universally shared as previously thought. You've skipped a step there, Falco. You see, you've skipped a step there. You haven't established that Trump is sexist or racist. In fact, you've talked about the Obama birther thing, and you've assumed that means racism, but it doesn't necessarily. And you've not talked about the sexism thing at all. Oh, but the locker room talk, yeah, they do let you do it. That's the point. But if it's true, though, Falco, if it's true, then what have you got to say about that? Can something be both true and sexist at the same time? If it can be, then does truth not matter more? Well, I would prefer that Trump treated it like the truth is more important, and that's what he did. I mean, it was a candid hot mic moment, but this is normal. This is a normal kind of conversation. Women have those kinds of conversations too in the right contexts, particularly voracious women in the right context. Absolutely, they talk like that as well. So this is just normal human behavior. It always has been, the locker room talk thing. And other than that, no, there's no sexism. No one in the US or in the world believed that Trump was sexist or racist until the press started saying he was. And if you were looking that hard for information to imply it, you could definitely find similar stuff from lots of other political candidates at the moment on both sides, and figures that perhaps Falco would like more. So yeah, you've skipped a step there. You've gone from one premise, which is that Trump became popular, and then you've assumed the premise of Trump bad, and then you're going to the conclusion of therefore the US had to contend with the fact that sexism and racism were just normal now. You've missed out a premise, Falco, and it's very important that you get that premise in there. But we'll continue reading, even though we've already figured out the gist of the problem here. He says, as a result, any humor derived from jokes on these premises suddenly went from it's funny because it's absurd to it's funny because it's true. Now, let's talk about this briefly, because this is separate from Trump. But it's funny because it's true. Again, can something be both sexist and true at the same time? If I say that a community of high intelligence people is more likely to have more men than women in it, that's a statistical, essentially, certitude. Because women's IQs cluster more in the center, men's IQs spread further out. So if you have a community filtered for high IQ, you're more likely to have more males in it than females. If I say that women are more emotional than men, or they tend to be, is that sexist? Both of these statements are true. Are they also sexist? If I say that women care more about non-practical things, or that women focus more on the short term, I think you could argue in some context that, or short term in some senses anyway. Probably could qualify that more, but you get the idea. I could say things that are true, but that some would interpret as sexist. Women are much more willing to sell their bodies than men. Women are more physically vain than men. You could say all these things. These are all true, and yet you could also argue them as sexist. Now, I don't think they are sexist. I think that the term sexist has a meaning which is quite different from what you think it is, Falco, and from what most of the left, and frankly most of everyone thinks it is. But it's about judging the individual on the standards of the group. Assuming that some individual must follow these standards or must be of these standards. It is literally prejudice, that's the point. Prejudging someone by the standards of their group. That's anti-meritocratic, anti-individualist, and just kind of personally immoral. So you shouldn't do that. But describing the standards of the group is not sexism. And so something can be true and, in your opinion, sexist at the same time, because you have the wrong definition of sexist, but let's leave that for now. So it's funny because it's true. Some of these things that needed to be said had nothing to do with Trump becoming president, by the way, though they correlated with it, are funny because they're satirical, are funny because of the way they're presented often, are funny because they are not popular, but are true. And especially when something is true, but not popular, it's quite easy to make it into a meme. Hence, you get a slew of what you would think of as racist and sexist memes, because there is truth to them, or at least it's easy to believe there's truth to them in many cases. You talk about racial IQ differences, and yeah, you can try to account for it with socioeconomic factors, but you can't do it 100%. Memes about that topic are easy to make, speak to something true, and can be funny. So they will always going to exist. Same thing with sexism. So you've made a lot of leaps here, and I don't think any of them really make sense. But possibly the worst leap that you've made here is that merely Trump being president changes the perception of the norms of an entire nation immediately. I think it's very much this postmodernist norms come from media perspective, but turn up to 11. Because norms do at least somewhat come from media, but they also come from biology. Now, that's something that a lot of leftists fail to take into account. They come from biology, and your biology is what ultimately produces the media. People can often defy their biology and be very different from it and go experimental and go into the space of the theoretical, quite different from their base biology, but ultimately they're sort of biologically determined to do that. So it's where was I? Yeah, those two things, those two factors both matter, and it's always going to originate somewhere in biology. And in like wide-scale culture, and that culture's derived from genetics. That genetics partially derived from landscape, the literal geology, all this stuff. They're all factors, all still factors. Even today, you can still trace it all back. So it doesn't change that quickly. You can't just get one president come in and suddenly the entire nature of humor changes. Particularly then. You would expect that it wouldn't change amongst the whole population, only a small portion. But even then, it would be too quick. People were making the same jokes before Trump got in that they were after. What you could say is that Trump being voted in gave people the perception that they were not alone in believing the things that they believed, even whether joke or not. So yeah, kind of... Yet another huge leap here at the end of this paragraph. Let's continue, though. He says, which brings us to today when we have people posting memes in Meme Shrine that would make even Moon Man blush. Moon Man ain't shit, as far as I know. Actually, I don't know much about him. I think he's some sort of like musician. Where does the humor from these memes come from, says Falco? And let me guess, evil. Can it really be said that it comes from a shared understanding that racism is bad when this is a community who will whine on end about how Ariel shouldn't be black in earnest? Now, Falco, how is that racist? Ariel isn't black. That's the point. She isn't black. So if the movie is going to make her black, that says something. Now, the problem with the movie isn't that she's black. There have been occasions of race-swapping characters in film history that haven't really been a problem. But there hasn't really been a time in film history where there wouldn't be at least a suspicion that it's being done for ideological reasons. And in fact, in that case, it is. Now, what you find in media is that when there's a race-swapped character, the product itself is much worse. Not necessarily because of the race. Oh, it could be incidental. But it's just much worse in every way. The reason is that people who aren't talented but are very ideological will race swap. Therefore, because they're not talented, the show will suck. It's a strong indication. So in my opinion, the race swapping is not actually the problem. It's the indicator of a problem. And what we're talking about with when they race swap, for example, Ariel, is not a black person could not play Ariel well. I don't think many of us believe that at all. A good movie could be made with a black mermaid. Even if it's not Ariel specifically, it could exist. That's no problem at all. The problem is the kind of people who would do this have these beliefs and this psychology, and look how badly they've done it, aside from anything else. Therefore, it will suck. And it did. And then it did. So, yes, if you believe that it's racist to say that, then you are several layers removed from the what the term racism is actually good for, which is for individualism. Yeah, and again, irreverence itself can produce a comedic effect. Partly because society expects you to say one thing and you say the other. It can be that simple, as evidenced by the fact that it works. So that could be all it is. There are some people in Cabal who don't believe racism is wrong. I don't think it's the majority, especially when you define racism the way I would. I think probably most would agree that that's not a good idea. Treating an individual by the standards of a group. Of course, if they're an individual in a mob exhibiting the standards of the group, then you treat the individual. But if you don't know anything about them except their race, then you don't assume that they are exactly the avatar of their race. Even if perhaps statistically they are likely to be, they might not be. Especially if you have the choice, and if it matters, you treat them like a person, you learn about them, but as soon as you learn one thing that indicates they're like their group, you can begin to judge after that. Just try not to prejudge, because it's anti-meritocratic, anti-individualist. It's not how you run a healthy society. So I think most people would agree with that. But so the comedy is not coming from, again, it's a faulty premise that I've explained, but he hasn't heard the explanation. So it's not necessarily coming from the knowledge that it is bad. For some people, that's where it comes from. It's like it's risky, it's edgy. But for some people, they do believe it. They use that to make jokes, and a lot of those jokes are based in irreverence, in an unexpected opinion, perhaps something so extreme it's funny. But there are others too. There's all kinds of ways of making comedy out of this. You can make comedy out of almost anything. So you've set up a premise here where you've very much limited the realm of available justifications for this behavior. And then you've acted bemused when your hypothesis doesn't meet reality. And instead of blaming your hypothesis, you blame reality. You assume then that people are just, I don't know, evil? I mean, what's the implication here? Let's continue reading, see if we can find out. He says, or is the humor meant to be derived from the idea that these are truths that cannot be spoken because of an increasingly tyrannical cancel mob on Twitter? Yeah, that's closer. It's the irreverence. It's deciding not to agree. The thing is, if you tell a group of people that they are not allowed to say something, whether you do that by legal force or undue social force, say from an overactive minority of the public, then some of them are going to capitulate, which is not good, because it's not right to be able to tell people what they can and can't say. And then some will defy you. And even if they would not have said those things in the first place, they now know what you don't like. And so it becomes not only an act of retaliation to say that thing, but a very pointed and meaningful act of retaliation. Because now not only are you retaliating by doing the thing they don't like, but you're making it clear why. You're making it clear what you're targeting. You're making it clear what you don't like that they're trying to impose on you. By saying it, it's, you can interpret that as honest racism, but you could also interpret that as rebellion against undue speech standards, especially when it is not racist to merely describe people that way, unless, of course, you are prejudging them. In my opinion, given what I think is the most sensible definition of racism. Putting up a sign that says people are allergic to bananas, I guess so, yeah. If you give people stupid standards, and especially if you make threats, some of them will capitulate, but that's not good that they do. Those that don't may rebel exactly in accordance with what you've said they can't do. Now, you could use this to control people. And I do wonder if perhaps our opponent, and I don't wonder this, I think I know that they intended this to some extent, but it didn't really work. That our opponents, the establishment, the deep state, whatever you want to call it, had at some point, at some level, there was some plan to try to make the right wing racist. And it's worked a little bit, but the bulk of the right wing is not. In fact, they maintain an individualist stance, which I'm very proud of, considering how many reasons they could have had not to. And this I think is why the establishment treats the left, not the left, sorry, treats, also the left, but treats non-whites with such kid gloves and tries to give them privileges. It's not necessarily so that they can replace whites, though that's a side benefit. It's so that the majority gets so pissed off with them. Because how do you create animus against a group? You give them undue privileges. And then you try and make like everything set up in a way that kind of looks like, yeah, someone wants the right wing to be racist. Someone wants race wars in the street. But it didn't really work. Instead, what they got is an individualist uprising against the standards they attacked as part of their attempt to achieve this, which is much better, much more intelligent way of doing it. Hopefully it works. It is so far doing quite well. We're making progress. It's difficult to describe. It's difficult to explain how comedy works. It's one of those things like politics where it is a thing because it's in flux. We're constantly just venturing slightly into the sort of black forest of the unknown. Constantly venturing just a little bit further, and it can't exist. It can't exist stably unless you're constantly venturing into the unknown with it. And so it's always slightly beyond total distillation. But what I've explained here today should give you a decent idea of sort of why it's happening. But the most important thing I would set out going forward is if you see a phenomenon happening, like people in an ostensibly individualist center-right libertarian Discord server acting like they think racism is funny, you see that phenomenon happening. If you can't explain it with a hypothesis, then don't just assume either malice or fault of reality. Don't just assume they have no reason to do it. And now you haven't, to be fair, or you hadn't. You sort of have at the end. Assume that you have not yet found the answer. And this is sort of how science works. You can't just assume, you can't just assume God, but I won't go there. You can't just assume that there is some mystical, unknowable answer, like non-answer, that there's no way no one could ever know, because it could just be a matter of time, and in history has sort of proven that it is, for most things, just a matter of time, that you could eventually figure it out. The whole irreducible complexity argument is just not true. It hasn't ever been true, as far as we know, for anything. You can argue that today there are some things that are currently irreducibly complex, but there's no reason to think they will be forever. I think it might even turn out that quantum physics is not probabilistic, that it might be deterministic. We just don't know the factors yet, and there's so numerous factors that we just don't know yet. It's not super likely, but it's possible. That's the kind of thing I mean. Don't assume reality is wrong, assume your hypothesis is wrong. At least start there. And that I think is what I'd recommend to Falco for this. If you don't understand it, well, try to understand it. Don't just blame it. Don't just say that's an error in the system. Try to understand it. And I hope that I don't defy that recommendation myself when analyzing the left. I think the left and the culture war in general. I think I try to understand it before just making judgments. Duchess is losing brain cells from reading this again. But yeah, I will give credit to Falco for writing a piece that appears to be trying to be serious. But you do need to analyze your logical connections here, because I noticed at least one incomplete syllogism. And I'm sure that there are others too I could construct from this, but you are making some leaps. You are missing some points that you may think are difficult to get across, such as that Trump man bad. But you do need to make that point, and I'm afraid you haven't. If you're founding your beliefs on something that you could only agree on with people that already agree with you on it, well, try to find a real answer. Try to find a better explanation. And although it would be difficult, you should be able to condense it to something which would actually fit in the Prevailer. Whereas this would take up most of an entire issue, if not an entire issue, and it's not really worth it.